I will start again. Hi, good evening to everybody. Thanks for joining and welcome to this webinar, where we will talk about how cyber warfare and cybersecurity impacts both the economy and investors. And I'm using we as a figure of speech because it's actually our guest, Joachim Klement, who will do all the talking. Joachim is a CFA charter holder, economist, and investment strategist based in London, working at Liberum Capital. Previously, he was CIO at Wellers Horf and Partners, and before that, head of the strategic research team and head of equity strategy for UBS Wealth Management. Joachim studied mathematics and physics at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology and graduated with a master's degree in mathematics. And in addition, he holds a master's degree in economics and finance. Throughout his professional career, he has looked at markets through the lens of a physicist obsessed with the human side of financial markets. Joachim has a delightful blog called Klement on Investing. He is also a trustee to the CFA Research Foundation, where he has published numerous papers, and he regularly contributes to the Enterprising Investors blog. We will share all the links at the end of the webinar. And no figure of speech this time, Joachim. It's a real honor to have you here with us. And without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alejandro, and good evening, everybody, from nice and sunny London. Yes, as Alejandro has mentioned, I am a trustee of the CFA Institute Research Foundation, and a topic that I'm going to present about today, the geopolitics of data, is effectively one chapter in a book that I have published for the CFA Institute Research Foundation. The good news for all of you is I'm not here to ask you for money, because the book and all of its chapters are available for free, which I know for a banker is something really weird to do, but so am I. I'm not really the average banker, as you might have guessed from the introduction and my background in natural sciences. So without further ado, I'll try to kind of do a little bit of a deep dive into the cybersecurity chapter in the next half hour and try to give you an idea of why I think this is a topic that on the one hand is underestimated at the moment by many investors, and at the same time is likely to become more and more important over the next 5 to 10 years. In fact, if you read the book, you will find out that there are, in my view, 3 major geopolitical trends that will shape our investment world and our economies over the next 10 years. One of them is the overarching, all-encompassing topic of climate change and the shift from fossil fuels to renewable energy. And I have 2 chapters on that in the book. So I won't talk about it here, but have a look at it because it will have material impacts, not just on different economies, but also on, of course, companies in the energy sector and the way investors can benefit from this shift. The second trend that I identify in the book is all about the rise of China. Again, this is a very commonly debated and discussed topic. China is about to become the world's largest economy, and with that economic might comes more political assertiveness of China. The Chinese government is increasingly, well, aggressive is the wrong word, but increasingly demanding its rightful place at the table of international organizations, and Chinese businesses are increasingly shifting to the Western world and competing with Western companies in all kinds of fields. Again, another chapter in the book. Now I want to focus on cybersecurity and the access to data and information. We all kind of flippantly tend to say that data is the oil of the 21st century. But what does that really mean? Well, in order to motivate that, let's have a look at this little formula. And I apologize for using a formula. The common slogan is that with every formula you use, you lose half your audience. I hope that in a CFA setting, this is not the case. However, I use this formula to illustrate how geopolitical events and developments can influence investors and investment markets. And that is something that was behind the motivation to write that book, in the sense that there are a lot of people who are experts on geopolitics. There's a long list of names. You probably know one or two of them, or more than that. But the general problem that I had as a politics junkie with a lot of these experts was that they have a background in foreign relations, they have a background in political sciences, and they look at geopolitical problems from a political lens. Now that is perfect. That is kind of what you would expect. However, I'm an investor. I manage portfolios, and I've managed portfolios throughout my entire career. And the problem that I always had with a lot of these experts in geopolitics was how to translate that into my investment decisions, and what is important and what is not important, kind of separating the wheat from the chaff. So what I did in this book is come from the opposite side. I'm not a politics expert. I haven't studied politics at university, and I don't have a degree in foreign relations. I have an investment background. So I kind of am the outsider looking at geopolitical events and trying to figure out how to make sense of them as an investor. And the present value formula that you see in front of you is kind of the way how I like to think about it in principle. Because geopolitical events and developments can influence, for example, future cash flows of your bonds or your equities or other assets. For example, a company that is expanding into China will obviously have higher sales growth than a company that is purely operating, say, in France, the UK, or wherever you want to do it domestically. And with that comes higher future cash flow growth and higher value for the equity, hopefully. So the opening up of Chinese economies and other events like that, they're geopolitical in nature, have over the last 20 years influenced the present value of such companies. Similarly, geopolitical events can influence the risk-free rate. Classic example, wars, terrorist attacks might lead to an enormous scare in terms of investor sentiment and consumer sentiment, and might force a central bank to cut interest rates and to lower the risk-free rate of return in order to counteract the impact of this geopolitical event. Of course, on the other hand, geopolitical events can influence inflation. If we think back of the 1970s, the oil crises are the poster child for that event, where OPEC cut its production, cut its exports to the Western industrialized nations, thus creating an oil price shock that led to higher inflation, and that obviously influenced stock markets, bond markets, currency markets all over the developed world. And finally, geopolitical events can influence the risk premium that we pay for certain assets. Terrorist attacks are a classic example where people might become more risk averse for a short amount of time and then kind of change back to a more normal, relaxed stance over time. And that might be a short-term shock to the present value, to the fair value of some assets. But I will also show you that these impacts on the risk premium can, in some instances, be permanent or longer lasting. And it is important for investors to understand when such geopolitical events, such as cyber attacks, can influence the risk premium permanently or at least for a longer time period than a few days or weeks. Now, to go into medias res, before we do that, I would like to ask you a couple of questions, just to test a little bit how good you are in your knowledge about cybersecurity risks and cyber warfare. So the first question is, what is the estimated value at risk, the potential losses from cyber attacks on private companies between 2019 and 2023? So this 5-year period where we are in the middle of right now, excluding governments, just private businesses, how much is the worldwide estimated cost over those 5 years? Is it A, 50 billion US dollars, roughly the annual GDP of a country like Slovenia? B, $500 billion, roughly the GDP of a country like Belgium? Or is it C, $5 trillion, roughly the combined annual GDP of France and the UK? Please submit your answers now, and let's see what you think the right answer is.
So just 10 more seconds.
In the chat, I saw the question var at what significance. This is not a value at risk like the typical 95% or 99% value at risk, but just the estimated total damage to companies from cyber attacks. You're welcome. Lovely. So it's a 50-50 split between 500 billion and 5 trillion. That's interesting. I will not give you the answer right away because otherwise you would just hang up and go home and do something nice. Instead, I will give you the answer throughout the presentation. But before I go through the presentation, another question for you. Why should we care about cybercrime in general? Because obviously the world's most prominent targets for cyber criminals are banks. It's the old saying, why did you rob the bank? Well, because that's where the money is. But which sector is the second most popular target of cybercrime? Is it A, healthcare, B, software and and C, utilities? Please submit your answer now.
Again, just a few more seconds.
We should have some elevator music while we're waiting. Okay. It's a pretty even split between healthcare, software, and utilities, which is quite interesting. And if you had asked me before I started to write the book, I would have guessed healthcare as the second most prominent sector as well, which is kind of the plurality of you. Again, I will show you the answer in a couple of minutes' time. Now, before we do that, let's do a little bit of a survey of cyber criminality, cyber security, cyber warfare. Who are the main players of cyber in the cyber warfare, cyber security space? Well, the first group is probably one of the two groups that you're most familiar with. It's just common criminals, hackers. They are usually trying to break into databases and steal information about credit card data or social security data and steal people's identities, or they're directly trying to steal electronic money and equivalents, for example, airline miles, or shoppers' points from supermarket chains and things like that. So consequently, because they're essentially after data that is easily made into money, they're targeting banks, consumer companies, and software companies. And who are these players? Well, they range from the small-time hacker, which is the kind of proverbial kind of guy in the basement of his parents' house, to criminal organizations and terrorist organizations who use cyber attacks and cyber crime as a way to finance terrorist attacks. In fact, if you look at the proportions and the cyber losses that are estimated each year from cyber criminals, about 3/4 of them actually come from some kind of organized criminal entity. So it's literally the mafia or the digital mafias out there that cause most of the damage, while nation state and state-sponsored activists, which includes terrorist organizations trying to finance their activities, account for about 20% 15 to 20%, and about 10% is the rest, which are hacktivists accidentally causing damage, and simple individual mercenaries, as I said, the proverbial guy in the basement of his parents' house. So as you can see, the poster child that we see in movies isn't really the most threatening person when it comes to cyber criminals. In fact, it tends to be the organized crime. And I know being a banker is not really the most future-proof job these days. The financial industry is kind of in decline, especially here in the UK. So I tried to kind of give you a little bit of an idea, if you're thinking about a career change and becoming a cyber criminal, what it would cost to set up shop. So apparently, and trust me, I don't know that firsthand, I just heard these numbers from different reports. The darknet prices for traditional malware is basically a subscription-based fee. Whitehall is $600 a month, Sweet Orange $1,800 a month, Cool, never heard of any of these names, is $10,000 a month, but I presume that the higher price means it's a bit better malware than Whitehall. And then there are zero-day malware. Zero-day malware actually is something really, really interesting because it is attacking a vulnerability that is deeply ingrained in either the hardware of a computer or in the individual software to such a degree that it is hard or impossible to fix with patches. And so zero-day malware for Windows costs about $60,000. For Mac iOS, if you want to hack somebody's iPhones, it's about $100,000. So that's obviously, because it's harder to fix, harder to detect, it is clearly more expensive. But in essence, it is quite, I would say, almost affordable to set up shop as a cyber criminal, which is one of the reasons why it is so lucrative. The initial investment, the CapEx spending, so to say, is pretty low. Then there are the second entities, main actors, which are state-sponsored actors, but not really state employees, so to say, government employees. These guys, and the most prominent players here is the Internet Research Agency in Russia, and on the bottom right, you see actually their headquarters, a picture of the headquarters in St. Petersburg, as well as groups like Fancy Bear and Cozy Bear, that are not directly Russian, say military, for example, but are sponsored and backed by the Russian government and the Russian military. And they are after all kinds of things, but mostly military secrets and political data. They're obviously also looking for electronic money, but it's less of a target for them. And they're also trying to spread disinformation, as everybody who's followed the investigations into the 2016 campaign interruption by Russians in the United States has found out by now. So they're targeting mostly political targets, whether these are parliament and other political institutions or indirect political targets like central banks. These are their main targets. And they also obviously target simple banks and bank-like institutions like the SWIFT payment network. How successful are they? Well, in the book, I write that Fancy Bear and Cozy Bear have 27 Wikipedia entries. The book was written a little bit more than a year ago. By now, they have 32 Wikipedia entries of major hacks that have been reported in the media. So that's not counting anything that we haven't heard about in the background. But definitely they are very prominent, they're very active. They have, for example, tried to access data on COVID-19 vaccines from different companies. They have been involved in the Sunburst malware supply chain hack in late 2020 that I will mention again in a little while. So they are really after all kinds of information that is useful for their sponsors. The third set of actors, cyber armies, literally talking about government employees here. And they are typically only covering military and political data, including infrastructure data. And they target military installations, parliament and other political institutions, as well as infrastructure. Main players here, The United States Department of Defense has stated in 2018 that they estimate that there are more than 30 different cyber armies around the world. Of course, they wouldn't count their own cyber army, even though the NSA in the United States is probably the best equipped and the most developed cyber army in the world. So let's say there are more than 31 cyber armies, with the United States with the best capabilities, China and Russia not far behind, and then Iran and North Korea as other state-sponsored players or state players that are really, really influential. Okay, what kind of damage can they do? We know there are these kinds of very different players from very different degrees of sophistication, from simple malware up to state-sponsored, extremely sophisticated attacks. The most common damage that is done by cyber criminals, whether they are part of an organized crime syndicate or individual hackers, doesn't matter, but they're targeting individual companies. For example, in 2003, Target lost customer data, cost them about $18.5 million. That's not a lot, especially not for a major company like Target. Well, Malware lost $300 million in the fallout from the Stuxnet infection. WannaCry outbreak, sorry, Maersk was WannaCry. WannaCry also hit Taiwan Semiconductors, cost Taiwan Semiconductor $170 million. And the Russians used SolarWinds, that US-based supply company for internet security, to hack into all kinds of government agencies, from FBI to NSA, but also into Microsoft systems. Apparently, they were able to see the source code of Microsoft Windows. Personally, as a Mac user, I would say that is a worthless target, but apparently in the open market, you do get some money for Windows source code. In any case, you see how the progression from something like tens of millions in 2013 to hundreds of millions, if not billions at this point in time, has happened over the last 10 years. And when we come to the everyday cost of cybercrime, well, here's the answer to the second question that I asked you. Which are the sectors that are most commonly attacked and have them experience the most damage from cybercrime? Banks, obviously the most. Roughly around the world, per bank, on average, $18 million in damage. If that doesn't sound much, you have to multiply that by the 3,000 and something banks that you have around the world, and you get results that are in the hundreds of billions in losses each year. Interestingly, the second most commonly targeted sector are utilities. And the reason for that is twofold. First, utilities have an awful lot of customer data, whether it's your electricity bill that has your address on it, etc., as well as usually the size of the house, which gives you an indication to how much money you make or how wealthy you are, to the fact that utilities companies actually are vulnerable targets for a lot of state-sponsored actors, because shutting down parts of the infrastructure causes an enormous amount of damage to the economy and to financial markets. And only after that comes software, and then further down healthcare, the option that I chose before I wrote that book. However, if you want to have an idea of how much damage is done by these cyber criminals, well, think of it this way. 2017 estimates said that the direct contribution of the internet to US GDP in 2015 was somewhere between 3.2% to 6% of US GDP. At the same time, the cost of cybercrime was estimated to be between 0.6 to 2% of US GDP. Now, basically what it says is that in the worst case scenario, cybercrime costs almost as much as the minimum amount that the internet actually adds in terms of GDP benefits. But for more generalist purposes, I would say cybercrime costs us roughly 1 to 2% each year of GDP. So the damage is tremendous. It's really, really big. And that should give you pause for thought, because if we could reduce that damage, that obviously would be beneficial for our investments and for our economy overall. How much is it? Well, and where does it come from? It's obviously the information loss, but it's all kinds of other stuff as well. Roughly 13 million US dollars per company per year on average. If you add that all up for the 5 years from 2019 to 2023, that was the first question I asked you, the total amount of losses from cyber criminal activities over those 5 years is expected to top $5 trillion. So more or roughly the same as the GDP of France and the UK together. It's a tremendous cost to businesses. It's a tremendous cost to the economy. Yet, if we look at the share price reaction to cybercrime, you see this. If it's a small breach, which in this case means it's a study of several dozens, I think more than 100 cyber breaches, cybersecurity breaches in the private world over the last 5 to 10 years, since 2013, so 8 years now. And if it's a small breach, meaning less than 1 million customer data items were lost, you wouldn't notice it in the share price. If it is a large breach, a severe breach, you do see that risk aversion towards that company increases for about 1 to 3 months, but after 6 months, it already is back to normal. So basically what it tells you is that at the moment we're in an environment where a cybercrime attack is a buying opportunity for investors who are willing to hold stocks long term. Even if I go back to the SolarWinds scandal of late 2020, SolarWinds share price, I looked it up, dropped from $24 per share to $12 to $14 per share, and is by now up to $18 per share. So even though this company was responsible for one of, involuntarily, but still responsible for one of the largest hacks ever, it is on the path to recovery. However, there are exemptions to this rule of use a cyber attack as a short-term setback that recovers in the next 6 to 12 months. And that, for example, is when it becomes really expensive. For example, attacks on the financial system. Here we have examples from the Cleveland Federal Reserve Bank, which lost 400,000 credit card details of 400,000 credit cards. Banco de Chile lost $10 million in a SWIFT-related transaction attack. And Bangladesh, the Central Bank of Bangladesh lost 81 million in the world's largest bank robbery in 2019, which was orchestrated by North Korea. How much does a successful attack on a major bank cost? Well, if a major bank experiences a successful cyber attack at the rate of the average rate from 2011 to 2016 is what you see here, the average loss. The baseline scenario is roughly 10% of net income. The severe scenario is one where the bank experiences roughly cyber attacks at twice the rate of what we experienced over the last 10 years. And the average loss is somewhere around 25% of net income. And the 5% tails, as you can see here, can go up to 40% of the bank's net income. That is a shock that you can't digest in a couple of months. That is something that lasts longer to the bank. And it gets even worse because if it's a systemically relevant bank, and it creates contagion to the financial system. Overall, it can easily create damages in the range of 20% to 30% of the net income of the affected banks. In essence, a successful major cyber attack on international banks or the SWIFT payment system could create another banking crisis. And we're lucky we so far haven't experienced that. Are cryptocurrencies the answers? I'm not going to go too much into cryptocurrencies and blockchain technology, but in essence, we're still struggling with what is commonly called the scalability problem of cryptocurrencies, namely that Cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, Ethereum, etc., can only manage a small number of transactions per second. However, if you want to replace something like the Visa credit card system, you need to be able to have 24,000 to 45,000 transactions per second. And so far, only Ripple is coming close to that, because the latest iterations of Ripple are able to get to compete with Visa. But in essence, we're not there yet. Blockchain as a method to kind of secure transactions could one day become a good defense mechanism against cyber criminals, but we're not there yet, and it will take a couple more years before we even can think about that. Now, which brings me to the end of my presentation and the last topic. And this is where I become all German. And as you know, we Germans are world champions in pessimism. So here is me being really, really pessimism. We haven't experienced anything like that yet, but there is the possibility of what is commonly known as the big one, a successful, long-lasting cyber attack on vital infrastructure. And to give you an idea how that might look like, the University of Cambridge Judge Business School has created a scenario analysis based on the following fact pattern. They assume, and by the way, let me be clear to begin with, such an attack as what I'm going to discuss now is way beyond the capabilities of even the most sophisticated criminal organizations. It is only within the reach of cyber armies like the NSA or the Chinese, Russian, Iranian, and North Korean cyber armies. Nobody else is even remotely capable of doing that. But let's assume that a disgruntled technician at a major utility company in the UK, this is a scenario for the UK, starts to work as a spy for a foreign intelligence agency. This technician secretly installed small boxes of hardware and power substations. So substations are basically the transformers that take the high voltage down to regular voltage for factories and households and everyday use. And he successfully installed some of these hardware boxes around London without activating them. It is assumed that these boxes can be activated remotely and can remain undetected for weeks before they're being activated. And then once when all the boxes are installed, they're turned on simultaneously. And then the guys made 3 scenarios. Scenario S1, 65 substations across London are impacted and basically break down regularly for about 3 weeks. And it creates power outages on average of about 1.5 weeks in the affected areas that are serviced by those 65 substations. S2, 95 stations, takes about 6 weeks. On average, power outages for about 3 weeks. And then there's the X1 extreme case scenario, which basically means 125 power substations for 12 weeks, creating power outages in London all over the place for about 6 weeks, on and off. What would be the impact? Well, it would mean that somewhere between 8 to 13 million people in London and around London would face constant electricity shortages and outages, constant blackouts. Digital communication would be affected, obviously. So no Wi-Fi, guys, that is a severe disruption of everyday life these days. But also water supply, because water is typically pumped with electric pumps through to different houses and factories. And wastewater is treated with a lot of electricity. Something that I did not know for a long time and only recently learned when I dived deeper into ESG considerations is wastewater treatment utilities consume about 3% of the electricity of a major city like Paris or London. It's incredibly energy and electricity intensive to clean wastewater. And if you don't have electricity, well, your wastewater will just kind of spill around everywhere. What does that mean in terms of total losses in percentage of UK GDP? Well, it is somewhere in the range from 0.4% for the smallest, shortest power outage scenario to up to 3% for the most extreme case. In short, such a successful attack on vital infrastructure in London would push the UK economy into a recession, or very close to it. If that sounds very, very far-fetched, well, the Iranian cyber army managed to successfully attack a power station supplying Istanbul with electricity and managed to create power outages for 12 hours in Istanbul in 2015. Similarly, just to give you an idea, in 2003, there was a power outage in the northwest of the United States. And that wasn't a cyber attack, but what happened was, because of a software malfunction, the central headquarters of the utility company did not see that there was a damaged power cable in one of its areas. And as a result of that, the company was oblivious to the fact that if they pushed more electricity into that part of the grid, it would overload the grid. So the company, because of basically the same effect that malware would have on their headquarters, on their controllers, started to push more electricity into a damaged grid, overloading that grid, creating a total collapse of that grid, and then as a result, following up, creating more and more blackouts all the way to Toronto and New York, which lasted for several days. So we've had some relatively close calls. I hope we're never going to deal with the real thing, because that is really an extremely damaging scenario that I don't really want to live through, because as I said, it could trigger an entire recession. So to summarize, cybercrime is already everywhere. It already costs us substantial amounts of money. It impacts a lot of businesses already, even though investors are not paying enough attention to it at the moment. I think it's going to be worse and worse over time. However, none of these kind of data security breaches and cyber attacks on private companies are likely to cause a major disruption to markets or the economy, unless banks and the financial system are severely impacted, in which case we might face the risk of banks suffering extreme losses that can, in the case of an underfunded bank or a bank already in distress, lead to the collapse of an individual bank, or in the worst case, can create a financial crisis. Or if we get that extreme case of a successful, long-lasting attack on major infrastructure of a major city, like Paris, London, New York, you name it, in which case that could trigger a proper recession. With that uplifting note, I would like to end here and open up for questions if you have some. So please raise your hands if you have questions. Or feel free to ask your questions in the chat.
Joachim, I have a question for you.
Yes.
Why do you think that people are not or don't feel too concerned about cybersecurity? Is it just because there hasn't been one of these disastrous attacks that you have been describing? Or is it because they still feel that it's a, so it's, my question would be, is it an unknown?
It is the classic effect. We tend to think about risks only after we experience them, only after they've become salient. My classic example is, you might be aware that the World Economic Forum, the WEF, every year publishes a survey of business leaders around the world, where they ask them, what do you think is the biggest risk to the world economy and at the moment? And you can go through this every year, and you will find that after a certain crisis hit, everybody's aware of it and considers it the most important risk. But none of the risks that are actually happening in the following 1, 2, 3 years are mentioned beforehand. So the classic example was that before the financial crisis, nobody had financial crisis or bank instability as a major risk factor. In 2009 and 10, these were in the top 2 of potential risks. Well, that's when it was already in the past. Similarly, in most recent years, climate change came to the fore as the most dominant risk in 2018, 19, 20, because we saw so many forest fires, floodings, hurricanes, etc. It was very salient. And guess what was the #1 risk in 2021 in the survey? It was pandemics. Because nobody thought of that being a risk. And admittedly, I didn't think of it as a major risk either, but it's very interesting how we only react to things once we've experienced a disaster. And cybercrime and cyber attacks and cyber warfare is a classic example for that.
Do we have any other questions? Feel free to raise your hand or unmute yourself.
I think everybody has fallen asleep.
No, I think that they might have an issue with their mute button, having experienced that before. Okay, if there are no further questions, then we can wrap it up.
We have a question.
Is there an interstate major initiative to prevent risk? Well, yes and no. There is an international initiative by, it's basically not the BIS, but the federal, the different reserve banks and central banks of this world have created a Financial Stability Board, that's the one that I was looking for, FSB, has created a working group to prevent cyber attacks to the financial system, in particular the SWIFT payment system. And a lot of asset managers and banks have signed up to that. As part of that, they have vowed to increase their capabilities in terms of IT security. They do spend more on IT security, but I haven't read anything in the last 12 to 24 months, 1 to 2 years, about progress being made. So it seems to be something like an administrative paper tiger where people tried to say, okay, let's do something about it, but then it was kind of overwhelmed by the concerns of the day. In recent years, there were attacks attributed to Israel to try to damage Iranian infrastructure to slow down the nuclear program. Would you consider Russian cyber attacks against Western infrastructure as part of the new threat, similar to what happened during the Cold War? Yes, absolutely. WannaCry and Stuxnet, the WannaCry was North Korean, Stuxnet was developed in a collaboration. We don't know, but we have strong suspicions and collaborations between Israelis and Americans, and was let go in Iran and originally incapacitated a lot of the centrifuges in the Iranian oil program, nuclear program, until somehow it got loose and ended up in all over the place in the Middle East. And that's basically how Miller-Maersk, for example, was affected and lost $300 million in the end. So that is already happening from the West to Iran and other countries. The Russians have already tested something similar in the case of Ukraine, because in 2015, they successfully attacked Ukrainian financial institutions to try to shut them down. And it is entirely plausible to me that the Russians, as well as other actors, whether it's North Korea, Iran, etc., are working on weapons. Maybe have even deployed these weapons already in the West to damage either military facilities or financial institutions. To give you an idea, in 2017, the US military sent an executive order to all its units to stop using drones from JDI, the Chinese drone manufacturer, because of security risks in the software. A year later, in 2018, the US Department of the Interior stopped using these drones as well. Now, you might want to say, well, why does the Department of the Interior have drones from China, and why do they care that much? Well, power plants, whether it's nuclear power plants or conventional power plants, are inspected regularly these days for damages by drones. And if the Chinese can hack into these drones, well, they can actually look at these power plants up close and personal. Similarly, there were other anecdotes in the sense that you might have heard in 2018 that Fitbit had a vulnerability because everybody's Fitbit GPS data was available online on their webpage, and journalists found that out, and they were actually able to track US soldiers operating on secret US military bases in the Middle East, and not only track the whereabouts of these secret military bases, but also their routine tours in the neighborhoods where they patrolled. So that was by accident. I'll give you another example. TikTok. Soldiers were using TikTok to make videos of themselves in military bases. Well, that's a wonderful way to look into the inside of what's going on in a military base. There you go. So there are plenty of these opportunities already around, and I think a lot of state-based actors on both sides, whether it's in the East or in the West, are working on deploying additional secret capabilities. Then there was a question about, do you think spreading trading over several hubs could limit the impact of an attack? Yes, definitely. Exchanges could reroute volumes away from impacted cities. Absolutely. That is the power grid, and is already set up in such a way that it has several fail-safe mechanisms, in the sense that normally, if you don't have a software glitch like the one that I explained with the Northwest US power outage, what happens is if a part of the power grid is down because the substation breaks down or cable breaks or whatever it is, the power is automatically rerouted. So there are fail-safe mechanisms in place, which is why a successful attack on infrastructure like the power grid of London requires you to attack dozens of substations at the same time. So all these fail-safes are basically overwhelmed. So in the utility space, that's already in place. That's why you need these extremely sophisticated attacks. In the financial space, it's also partly in place with stock exchanges and the SWIFT payment system, but it's not always the case, and we definitely can do more there. And that's, by the way, also the promise of blockchain technology as a way of distribute the information. It's really, really difficult, almost impossible, to hijack and compromise a blockchain system, which is why that is kind of a really good way to protect ourselves. As I said, there's a scalability problem at the moment. What cybersecurity companies are well placed to deal with the cited risks? Are they more or less featured prominently in the news, or mostly working in the shadows together with state-linked entities? Difficult question for me to answer, because I don't know which cybersecurity companies are actually working with different organizations on behind the scenes. We obviously don't know that. However, I would say that cybersecurity companies in general will be, from an investment perspective, a key beneficiary of this increased cybersecurity spending and the increased attention paid to these attacks. Cybersecurity companies these days are not just your regular kind of malware companies like Avast Security that you might have heard of, British company, but it also includes companies like Alphabet / Google that is very involved in that area. So they're definitely beneficiaries of that. One company that is, I think, not listed is Kaspersky Lab, which has been suspected several times. It's always unconfirmed, so don't take my word for it. I'm not making any accusations here of providing access to its software to the Russian government. So we don't know, but definitely when it comes to the Western, the British, the French, the US, American cybersecurity companies, I would say they're good investments that should all benefit from this trend. It's hard for me to say which ones are the ones that benefit the most. I used the word distributed ledger technology, and there seems to be that not everybody is familiar with that terminology. I don't blame anybody. Distributed ledger technology is the term of trade for how a blockchain works. It basically means that all the data of a blockchain is distributed across the participating computers in the network. So if you compromise and steal one computer, it isn't able to manipulate the entire system, because in order for a blockchain to be verified, more than half of the computers in a network have to come to the same conclusion with their calculations about the blockchain. So you can't just hijack one computer and then manipulate the entire blockchain. And that's what's called distributed ledger technology. Are Russians really the strongest hackers, or is it just a tradition to attribute the greatest achievements to them? I don't know. I would say the Americans are the strongest hackers, but in terms of top ranked, as I mentioned at the beginning, I think Russia, China, the US are neck and neck in their cyber warfare capabilities and in their knowledge. So it's hard for me to say which one is best of those. I think they're all very, very active. I think the reason why we hear so much about Russian cyber attacks is because they want, to some degree, they want to be discovered. Because part of the mission of the GRU, the Russian military secret service, and Fancy Bear, Cozy Bear, is to sow chaos and disinformation and insecurity. So a successful cyber attack for them is great. A successful cyber attack that is discovered and discussed in the media and creates uncertainty and confusion is even better for them. So they have a very different kind of incentive system.
So do we have any more questions? Maybe just one more question left. Do have 5 minutes. Great. Joachim, I'll let you read this one out loud.
What role do you think new technologies will play in mitigating the effects or damages from cyber attacks? Would like to know if you think the blockchain has any potential to provide a system that is at least not vulnerable to the regular attacks. So the blockchain has, as I mentioned, the ability to make existing systems much safer than they are at the moment. However, yesterday I was at a blockchain conference, cryptocurrency conference to be more precise, and somebody asked a very interesting question, at least for me as a physicist, a very interesting question. We are at the verge of creating quantum computers that actually work. Now, it's an entirely different presentation to talk about quantum computing, but quantum computers essentially can do the same amount of calculations in a minute that traditional computers can do in years, if not decades. And quantum computers are likely so powerful that they can easily outmaneuver and crack a blockchain, even the most modern blockchain today. So there could be a situation where we introduce blockchain technology to increase safety and security, and that works for a while, but maybe in 10, 15 years, quantum computers become reality and more widespread. We so far have only one claim of a successful quantum computation ever. But maybe in 10, 15 years we're there. And then the race starts all over again. It literally is an arms race, just like the arms race during the Cold War between hackers or criminals and companies / governments defending themselves. All right, thank you all so much.
Exactly. Thank you, Joachim. I just shared with everybody in the chat 3 links to Joachim's blog, a second blog, which is actually the CFA Institute Enterprising Investor. Joachim is also a contributor to this blog. And finally, the link to the Geoeconomics book of the Research Foundation, which has been the base of most of what Joachim said, but it contains much more interesting bits of information and very useful and hands-on information, because Joachim is a hands-on guy and he doesn't want just to write theoretically about things. He also wants to show practitioners some key insights. So I think it's a very interesting read. At least I found it to be a very interesting read. So Joachim, thank you so much for sharing your time and your insights on cybersecurity. It was also a real pleasure working with you while preparing this event. Thank you very much for your time. It's been a real pleasure. Please remember that the recording and the presentation will be shared with all of you, so you will be able to see Joachim again and again.
Not sure if that's such a great thing.
For everybody here, I think that you should, if you can, please spare some minutes and click on the link on the survey that Marie-Alex just shared with everybody. Your feedback is very valuable and it's really helpful for us to organize the event. And talking about events, our 2 next webinars are really interesting as well. On April 29th, we will be discussing on commodities. We will be trying to guess if this we're in the middle of a commodity super cycle or not. And then on May 20th, we have a webinar on climate change and the new disclosures for banks. So thanks to everybody for your time. Please stay safe and hopefully see you soon. And yeah, take a little bit of time, please, to answer a survey. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joachim.